Welcome to Weight Loss and Wellness for Real, the podcast where people like you get the practical solutions and support you need to permanently lose the physical and mental weight so you can feel better and live the life you want in the body and mind you want. If you're looking to overcome your stress eating, overeating, binging behaviors, and move to a place of freedom with food and your body, you're in the right place. Hey there, just real quick before we start the show, a reminder to head over to my website at heatherheynen.com. Heynen is spelled Heynen, and sign up for my free monthly newsletter on all things well-being. It's a really short and sweet newsletter focusing on creating healthy habits around mind, body, and soul. And also, I always include a protein-forward recipe as well as links to discount codes to products and companies that support this podcast. Head over there, sign up now. Hey everyone, before we start the show, just a couple things I wanted to mention. First, apologies in advance for the sound quality. I had a really hard time with this one, spent many hours trying to edit and work with tech support to get the sound better, and really to no avail, and finally just kind of gave up. There was something off with the platform when we recorded, and no one seems to be able to figure out some of the popping and different levels of volume. So anyway, done working with that, throwing it out there, but just sorry in advance for that. And then also just asking for your forgiveness on all my little mm-hms and my rights and my yeahs. I was the person in the, in college, if you're in those big lecture halls, I'm the one who was listening to the professor and nodding her head vigorously. Like, I just get excited about this stuff. And so those little sounds and all those things just kind of pop out of me, even though I don't want them to. I am working on this. I noticed it. I'm working on it. This is all new to me, doing interviews. And so I really learned a lot. And in the future, I'm going to try really hard not to let those sounds come out of me. And then beyond that, there is a lot of biochemistry that we go into in this episode, which is so fascinating and so cool. And this really is a really fascinating way to look at sugar addiction, metabolic issues, chronic disease. And so I think it's really important to listen to, even if you don't totally get it, if you're not a geek like me and don't like the biochemistry part, just, listen, hang in there, because throughout all of that, we are talking about really practical strategies that you can put into place. And then towards the end as well, we do more of a question and answer style. I do get to ask him questions, his opinions on a plant-forward diet, protein-forward diet. We talk a lot about overtraining and how to deal with some of those issues. So there is a lot of practical stuff more towards the end, but I really want you to try to stay with all of it as well. I think understanding what's going on in our bodies, what's happening, can really be helpful in making changes. All right, on to the show. Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. Today, I have a very special guest joining me to talk about some important topics, including sugar addiction, food addiction, and how this addictive process works in the body and what we can do to break that cycle. We're also going to discuss metabolic deficiency, weight gain, autoimmune issues, and how these things can present, as well as what we can do about them to live a healthy, long, and high quality life. So my guest today is Dr. DeLannoy. He earned his Ph.D. in biochemistry from the University of Colorado Boulder in 1990. His dissertation was in the area of molecular biology of gene expression at the level of RNA. He did his post-doctoral research in the area of RNA binding proteins, and later was tenured associate professor of chemistry at Black Hills State University. And this is actually where I met Dr. Pete. Dr. Pete spent 28 plus years teaching chemistry at the college and secondary levels, and most recently taught chemistry at the top-ranked charter school in the world, Basis Schools. He became interested in uric acid biochemistry when he was diagnosed with gout in 2016, and then pre-diabetes in 2019. He used his extensive training in biochemistry to understand and reverse his prediabetes and put his gout into remission. Since 2019, he has leveraged his doctorate in biochemistry and his extensive teaching experience to make the reversal of metabolic disease understandable through speaking and coaching. He has worked successfully with clients that suffer from gout, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and sugar addiction. Dr. Pete is a certified nutrition network health practitioner, and he is accredited by the Society of Medical Health Practitioners. Hello, Pete. Thank you so much for being here. I know you're just kind of waking up like me with your cup of coffee. So I thought before we get going, it might be fun for my listeners to know a little of our personal history before we get into all the things. So as I was thinking back on this, I was thinking we've known each other about 25 years. Yes.
Yeah, since 1991, I think, or pretty close to that.
It's been a while. I wanted to quick share with you, and then I am going to let you talk. But when I was thinking about this, one of the memories that I tell the most often has you included in it. And it was the one time in my life that I really thought I was going to actually die. Do you have any idea what I'm talking about?
No, you better tell the story.
So this is when we went to Mexico. You hired me and Mike, for the listeners, my ex-husband, hired us to go to Mexico with you. This is when you were teaching in Arizona at that private school.
Right.
We took some students, and long story short, we were in the middle of the mountains in Mexico. I mean, nothing around, nothing. And we were driving back from where we had been, and we got pulled over by the federales. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah.
And that was, standing there. We're in the middle of nowhere, the middle of the mountains. We get pulled over, all these federales holding machine guns. They put us into the ditch. They ransack our vehicles, steal things. Anyway, that's the one moment in my life I really, truly thought I was going to die in that moment.
Yeah, I think in those days, we were right on the sort of the cartels, whichever one moved into Sonora, that part of Sonora, and took over. And when I think back to those days, because I made that trip by myself a lot to be with my daughter, I used to get pulled over by myself by those guys. Later on, after those programs, we weren't doing them anymore. I had left Verde Valley School. Things got to the point in that region where, Americans just weren't traveling through there anymore. It was too dangerous.
For sure. So anyway, that's my little memory with you. Although I have many more, but that was, the one I always tell about almost dying. So, okay. So let me let you talk a little bit. Can you maybe just let us know about you and your story and your personal journey, and then we can kind of get into sugar addiction and how to break the cycle.
Okay. Well, you covered my history pretty well. I think to sort of have your listeners understand who I am a little bit more and why I do what I do now. I think I was a pretty common active person. I had a career teaching and was involved in raising a daughter. And while I used to be rock climbing all the time, there was this period where basically I really sort of became inactive. And this was because I had a daughter to raise, or at least contribute to raising. And I couldn't, I had to pay attention to a career. Anyway, the point is that I was eating the standard American diet, and hopefully we're going to talk more about this because I think to a really big degree this is misrepresented on all levels in our establishment, including our own space. I think we have to spend some time talking about that. And I was in a lifestyle where I wasn't really, I still believed I could get off the couch to do whatever, spend a little bit of time, exercising and working out, and that would allow me to lose weight, and it would allow me to get back my physical shape. But in 2016, when I was diagnosed with gout, I suddenly was excruciatingly aware that maybe my belief systems were not what I thought they were. But I wasn't to the point yet where I recognized that I literally was wrong about how I was thinking about food and exercise. I still had this idea that it was just a matter of getting myself into a consistent exercise program. I could lose the weight, because back then, when I was diagnosed with gout, I had an insulin resistant belly. And to be really clear about that, both men and women suffer from this. It's more apparent on men than I think than it is women. If you see these guys walking around in the supermarket, you can tell that they could take their dinner tray and literally just set it on top of their stomach and eat. It would support it. That's an insulin resistant belly. Mine was never that extreme, but it was there. And when I was diagnosed with gout, one of the first things that I did was join a CrossFit gym, and I started exercising with them. I was relentless in my pursuit of that. So I was in that programming 5 days a week.
Yeah, you were going hard.
I was going hard. And there was a change in body composition. However, the belly did not go away. It got a little smaller, which is what you would expect, especially when you hear, if you believe the argument, the calories in, calories out argument that our establishment pushes on us all the time. And I have a story about that too, that's more recent. When my daughter was giving birth to her boy, there was, in the hospital, there was a drink machine in the waiting room. And they literally are so bold that they put a little chart in the upper right-hand window of that in their opinion tells you how much exercise you've got to do after drinking one bottle of Coke.
Wow. I've not seen something like that. That's
yeah, amazing. I was totally shocked. I took a picture of it. And the only bottle of water, I mean, literally there was one little row of bottles that you could select from that was water, and 99% of everything else in there was sugary soda. But anyway, I spent 3 years working hard in CrossFit, and then I went in to do my bloods, because at the time of the gout situation, I also was hypertensive. You know, or the doctors would say, okay, it's pre-hypertension.
Right. You're riding that line.
Yeah, but I was always coming in at the 140s. And so after 3 years of CrossFit, I'm like, I had this big plan. I was going to go in. It was like mid-winter, January of that year. I was 60 years old, and I went in and had, the full bloods and everything done, and was super psyched, and went into the office, right? Had the blood pressure done, and it was still pre-hypertensive. And
eating.
Sure. And the doctor was like, well, that's just because I have the white coat on and you're nervous or whatever. But then a few days later, I got an email from him, and it was pretty shocking. The email, just to summarize it quickly, said, you're pre-diabetic, your fasting glucose is elevated, your A1C is, I think it was 5.7, incredibly high. But
I was gonna say, mine's like 5.4. I just got mine done. Is that bad?
No, we can get into more into that. So, but, and then the letter went on, and this is the thing that made me really angry about it. In the email, my doctor, who's not my doctor anymore, said, you need to get more exercise. And this is coming off, I'm a third-year CrossFit athlete.
Right.
And in my age group, there wasn't that many of us in the gym that were in our late 50s, early 60s. But, I was by far the hardest worker.
Yeah, you're tearing it up.
I know you. I'm sure you were. Yes. I can only imagine.
In that, and I'm looking at this email going, get more exercise.
Right.
That really made me angry. And then the pre-diabetes thing was they're going on about I should be on the Mediterranean diet. I already was eating in a way that was, I would argue that there's about 1 million different Mediterranean diets. Mostly, people here in the US don't understand the way that
Yeah.
category is
Right.
by our medical professionals and also, our culture. So I was already eating that way a lot, but I was also eating things on a daily basis that were not good for me. And I was drinking 3 beers a day and not beers that were low carbs. But then there's also issues with alcohol that our own space people are not talking about and
Right.
want to talk about. And
Yep.
I'm not really referring to the brain effect. I'm referring to the metabolics that we're going to get into. And also chocolate and ice cream, right? So one of the main things that email said though was that if you get the exercise thing right and you really go hardcore on the Mediterranean diet, with keeping, they called them healthy carbohydrates in there, that you should be able to slow the progression of this disease. So they're talking about progression. And so I doubled down on the Mediterranean diet to the point where I was actually like massing out the amount of healthy carbs that I was putting on my plate relative to, what was going on my wife's plate. I stopped with the chocolate, I stopped with the ice cream, and I stopped drinking beer and I went out because I'm a biochemist. There were 2 things that I did. The first thing is I went out and I bought a glucose meter. And then the other thing was, though, it really bugged me in the email about this concept of progression and the promise of medication down the road, that there was nothing I could do about this disease, that they would have plenty of drugs for me down the road. And as a biochemist and understanding that diabetes, I didn't know at the time that gout was related to this. And in fact, all of the other diseases that we're going to talk about are all driven by a central mechanism. There is a central metabolic mechanism that's driving this. Talk about today, and whether or not you end up being diabetic when you're 60 or you're just, obese, you're suffering from cardiovascular disease. Maybe the doctor has you taking statins, for example. It's your genetics that basically are interacting with the environment that you are imposing on your body, not just the food lifestyle that you're taking in, but also the other aspects. I'm sure that you work with your clients on the, their stress, exercise, and so on. All those things are the environment that you're interacting with, and your genetics interact with that. And whether you end up on the other end of that with which cluster of these diseases is going to depend on your genetics. At the time of the diabetes diagnosis or pre-diabetes, I did what they said, and I really doubled down on it. I even upped the amount of exercise that I was doing. So I'd go to CrossFit at 5 a.m. and then in the evening I'd be out in front of my house doing sprints.
Oh my, yeah.
Yeah, and my daughter and my wife both noticed this. They're like, "What are you doing?" But honestly, I didn't tell them about this issue with the doctor. I didn't even breathe a word of it. But after a couple of weeks, my wife noticed that the plates were looking different, and she noticed that I wasn't drinking, and she noticed that I wasn't going for the after dinner chocolate or ice cream. And she's like, "What the hell's going on?"
Yeah.
Finally, I told her. But here's what the viewers should understand. At the same time, I was measuring my fasting glucose and my glucose also post meal,
Okay.
half hour, 1 hour, and 2 hours. And I saw in a striking way that my glucose was not normalizing. In fact, it was getting worse. It was rising.
Right.
Finally, I was in the CrossFit gym on a Sunday afternoon, and one of the owners was in there who I knew pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
I was super frustrated because I'd had this, I'll call it a medically approved breakfast.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And my blood glucose post breakfast was ridiculous.
Yeah. Getting better, but kind of getting worse.
Getting worse. And
Mm-hmm.
he came over to talk to me because even before my wife knew, I told him about my pre-diabetes. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I kind of vented to him that everything that I was doing wasn't working, and all the exercise that I was doing wasn't having an effect. You know, it's like, it just wasn't happening. And finally, after listening, he said, well, it's because you're not cutting the carbs.
Mm.
Sarah Hallberg.
Oh, yeah.
And she is was a
Mm-hmm.
lipidologist. She's passed away, but
Mm-hmm.
obesity doctor. And she was talking about, in this video, she talked about the results that they were getting. She was, you know, the fact that if you want to reverse diabetes, all you need to do is stop eating the carbohydrates.
Right.
And
Right.
videos that metabolic disease has to do with what you put in your face.
Yeah. Right.
Metabolic disease, you should be able to reverse it by
Yeah.
changing what you eat. Understood this. Define a lifestyle based on the literature.
Mm-hmm.
I went home that night, and our plates, I didn't wait for the literature. I trusted Sarah.
Yeah.
She's, and I my blood glucose started to normalize within 3 days.
Yeah.
Like, it just comes straight down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in 52 days, my A1C had gone from 5.7 to 4.9. My lipid panel was beginning to it significantly normalized. Triglycerides came down, HDL went up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was all these things that she claimed should happen were happening. And then in addition to that, though, by that time, when my A1C was down, I
Mm-hmm.
was living literally out of the peer-reviewed clinical studies that they had published. So
Mm-hmm.
I put their papers down on the table, and then literally structured what I was eating based on what they had their patients doing. And that was my entry point into this stuff. And basically at that point and going forward, then the issue of gout reared its ugly head.
So it came back up for you.
Well, because I was, knowing that I was a gout sufferer,
Mm-hmm.
I also started to monitor my uric acid.
Oh, yeah.
I saw my uric acid on a ketogenic diet. In those days, I was eating less than 50 grams of total carbs, not net, total carbs per day. And I saw my uric acid skyrocket during the keto adaptation process. I mean, it was running anywhere from 9 to 12 or 13 mgs per deciliter.
So did that hinder you at all when you were seeing those readings? Like, okay, you know, my A1C came down, like, you know, I'm cutting out these carbs, but now uric acid going up. So, like, what are your thoughts at that point?
Well, I wasn't suffering any gout flares.
Okay.
And then, and was I concerned? Absolutely. Because when you start to look at the data, which I was doing full time and have been for the last 5 years, everything that I could learn about uric acid has been sort of a double-edged sword. Because the low carb space, those doctors, including Finney, and I had a discussion with him briefly at the low carb conference in San Diego, are going to tell you emphatically, oh, well, the uric acid will go back down once you're keto adapted. Well, I've been keto adapted now for 5 years. And then I've been coaching gout and coaching, as you've already pointed out, I've deal predominantly with really sick people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've dealt with people that are suffering from stage 4 chronic kidney disease,
Yeah.
full on type 2 diabetes, you know,
Yeah.
and what you see universally when people are finally keto adapted, and keto adaptation is something that you can spend a lot of time talking about too, because
Right.
again, the establishment's going to tell you, well, you're looking at 2 to 3 months
Yeah.
for
No, it could. I've seen year. I've seen a long period of time where it can take.
Yeah, and their own data shows that there are some people still adapting out at 20 months. It's
Yeah.
yeah, and I saw in my own, as you just pointed out, biomarkers that it was at least a year for me. I think the older you are and the more metabolically compromised you are, the longer it's going to actually take.
Yeah, I've had that same
For
thought,
that.
and it would make sense.
And everybody who's in that case
Mm-hmm.
remains hyperuricemic.
Okay.
The
Yeah.
uric acid does come down, but it's going to come down in most people, male or female,
Mm-hmm.
to about 6 mg per deciliter.
Okay.
And it will run on a daily basis between 6 and 8.
Okay.
And the problem with this is that when you look at the data on hyperuricemia, there's 43 million people walking around that are hyperuricemic in the United States, and these are people that are eating the standard American diet. There's
Right.
more people that are hyperuricemic than there are type 2 diabetics.
Oh,
So
fascinating.
this is a big deal, actually.
Yeah.
And the reason that it is because every single time somebody does a study to look at the relationship between elevated uric acid and cardiovascular disease, they find strong connections.
Right. Right.
Now, I'm not one of those guys. I don't like talking about observational data at all.
Okay.
The only time that I do really is at the beginning of my gout talks, where I want everyone to understand what the statistics actually look like. And then we go to peer review molecular science.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you and your viewers to understand that we regardless of whether we're talking about uric acid here or whether we're talking about other things that we were discussing like type 2 diabetes or obesity, our establishment, the low carb space, we're all guilty of this, especially the medical establishment. We're standing outside on a field looking back at a forest. 99% of the research that's being done is by people that are standing outside the forest, taking a bow and arrow, shooting the arrow, and trying to discern where the arrow is hitting. And then they're making a decision about what is driving disease.
Right.
And this is a fundamental problem in how we look at metabolic disease, because when you look at science in general on how cells function, cellular biology, that has been super successful in defining how cells work, the connection to cancer, for example, that work is done completely the other way around. We go to the simplest molecular single molecule systems that we can get to.
Mm-hmm.
We pull those into a test tube. We look at how those systems function. Then we take them inside the cell. We take them in vivo inside the cell into tissue culture. We have accepted model systems to look at those. Like in my own back in my own research days, we had yeast. We had HeLa cells, which was a cancer cell line from humans. We had Xenopus. We had fruit fly, and so on, right?
Yeah.
And we beat those systems to death in order to understand how DNA was interacting with proteins in order to make RNA, and then how to make the proteins that come from that, and how those proteins were involved not only in structural things but enzymes, how systems were operating. And then from there, basically we start moving through the forest,
Right.
coming the other direction.
Right.
And this is super critical to us. And so in terms of my own work, it was the gout thing that led me to uric acid. And then that led me to the work of Dr. Richard Johnson.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he has published over 700 publications in this area. He's worked in this area in decades.
I was just going to say, for a long time. Yeah.
For a very, very long time. And what makes him a stellar scientist is the fact that he understands, he was trained. I'm a trained biochemist, but he was a trained medical doctor. But his training was done by people that understand what I'm talking to you about how you have to step back and you have to go molecular, and then you have to bring everything forward.
Right.
If you don't do that, you basically cannot understand what's driving metabolic disease. And in terms of all of the central diseases, and sugar and alcohol addiction, they evolve together. We have the major mutations that happen with uric acid, and fructose uric acid metabolism happened around 20 million years ago, plus or minus. And then our ability to metabolize alcohol happened somewhere around 10 to 14 million. And the alcohol metabolism piggybacks on fructose uric acid metabolism. So, and how I made the connection between fructose uric acid metabolism and sugar and alcohol addiction was the fact that in a molecular study that was done by Johnson's lab, they showed that fructose activates a key protein in the brain. When the dopamine reward system gets activated, you have an elevation in this protein that's called delta phos-B.
Yeah.
And delta phos-B is induced by fructose. When you look at the other end of this and you go to the molecular work on delta phos-B, you literally take a walk into a laboratory that's run by Eric J. Nestler. And Nestler is working on the other end of this. So, again, when we talk about standing in a field looking at the trees, I think we have to be careful. And one of the frustrations I have is that guys like Nestler are not working close enough with guys like Richard Johnson. Because Nestler has shown that delta phos-B is also elevated and activated by sucrose. We need to talk about that. Sucrose is table sugar. Let's see. I want to look at my notes really quickly here. Yeah. Let's see. Where is it here? My list. Okay. Yeah. Fructose, sucrose. It's delta phos-B is elevated by exercise, stress, and also sex.
Hi, everyone. Guess what? I have a lovely discount code just for you, my listeners. The code is 10OFF. That's 10OFF. And it will get you 10% off any one of my online courses, which now include Mastering Mindful Eating, Overcome Binge Eating, Overeating, and Emotional Eating for Good. And I also have a course on When You Want to Stop the Weight Loss Medication, a comprehensive guide to weight maintenance and mastery. So if you've maybe lost some weight using a medication and you're now wanting to go off the medication but keep the weight off, this is the course for you. And any course you buy, you keep the course for a minimum of 3 years, maybe longer. It just depends on how many are purchased. All courses are self-paced, and I promise you they are practical, meaning they don't just tell you what you need to do. you actually engage in the skills and strategies needed to make actual lasting behavior change. You learn how to do the what. Okay, all courses have multiple modules with multiple lessons. All include lots of examples, tips, and tricks to make things simple and clear. And you also get lots of downloadable resources, including the daily planning template that I use with my own clients, the exact protocol to use after a binge or an overeat has occurred to minimize its damage on your body and your mind. There are protein cheat sheets, research-based journaling prompts, and the literal how-to checklists on the skill you are learning about. And with the weight maintenance course, you also have a movement module that will help you figure out how to make a movement plan that fits your particular lifestyle and level of fitness. And you also have a natural appetite regulation module. So whether if you have never tried an online course to change behavior, or if you have, I just highly would recommend that you try one of these. I've put my heart and soul into both of them. They are all research-based, and now you can get 10% off. So again, that code is 10OFF. If you're ready to make changes that last, you can go to my website, heatherheynen.com. Heynen is spelled Heynen. And from the main menu, click courses, and it will get you to where you want to go. Or you can click on the links in the episode description below the show. And again, as soon as you're there, when you're ready for checkout, just enter the code 10OFF, 10 off. And just a reminder, I also have an ebook cookbook that is now available. It's called Protein Forward Easy Recipes. It includes all high protein recipes, including breakfasts and sweet treats full of protein and lunches and dinner. Okay, so again, head to my website. It's probably the easiest thing to do, heatherheynen.com. Heynen is spelled Heynen. And from there, go to courses or the cookbook. And again, use code 10 off at checkout.
About this, and the way that Johnson thinks about this stuff is from an evolutionary point of view. So, and what I mean by this is that even if you look at the lowliest pond organisms that you can even imagine, like a paramecium, those organisms have all developed biochemical strategies that allow them to seek and find food, but not food in general. They will seek and look for specific substances that when they take them in will optimize the storage of substances that allow them to move from one food source to the next. And when you look at the animal kingdom, it doesn't matter which particular animals that you look at. Hummingbirds, bears, ground squirrels. There's a famous bird called the godwit that makes an 8,000-mile migration every year from Alaska to, I think it's New Zealand is where it goes. I'm pretty sure that's correct. And prior to the migration, this bird will start to gorge on food sources that allow it. Biochemically, it completely flips over into a system where all the incoming calories are converted into fat.
Yeah.
And once this bird takes off, it doesn't land. It makes the whole 8,000-mile trip in the air. And if it's mechanistic eating that goes on before it leaves to do that migration is inadequate, it literally will run out of energy, fall out of the sky into the ocean and die.
Wow.
And we have, all of these different animals operate similarly. Hummingbirds, for example, when they get up and they're out feeding on nectar, they'll run their fasting glucose from that of a human, what looks like a human, like mid 80s, let's say, mgs per deciliter, up to 700 mgs a deciliter by evening. So they're completely diabetic. And they're running a concentration of glucose in their blood that would kill a human. You'd be in the emergency room with glucose like that. Then they basically roost for the night, and by morning their livers are back to normal because they go fatty liver in that process. Over the course of the night, their livers are back to normal, and then their fasting glucose is back in the 80s, and then they go back to feeding on nectar all day, and they repeat this process. And there are some hummingbirds that make a 2,500-mile migration and operate a lot like the godwits. So they'll double their body weight in fat.
Mm-hmm.
And again, they run the same risk as the godwit. If during the migration they run out of fat energy, they burn all of it up, then they're going to die. It's that simple.
Wow.
So evolutionarily, animals all have systems that allow them to rapidly store fat and glycogen, and humans are no exception.
So we have that similar, and I think it's your word. I'm looking from your outline, but that similar switch, like literally a switch.
We literally have a fat switch.
Yep.
And I look at this from the point of view of literature. I look at this in a broader sense than Johnson does. He's responsible for discovering this and taking the risk of describing it, because there's a lot of pushback in the establishment. Even the low carb space will go, well, I'm not eating fructose.
Right.
So the fructose uric acid metabolism is not a problem, right?
Right.
Well, here's the issue. The issue is, and a lot of this has to do with our own educations. Like, even as an undergraduate, I used to ask my professors, well, what is the relationship between glycolysis and its connection with the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle, the oxidation of fats, and these other pathways? Fructose uric acid, what the hell is it doing?
Right.
If you take a medical biochemistry textbook and open it up, or one of the typical biochemistry textbooks that are being used to educate our undergraduates, and you open it up and look up the polyol pathway, which is the connective pathway between glycolysis and fructose uric acid metabolism, you find that pathway. It's a two-step biochemical process. You find it offered in those pages, completely isolated. There's no discussion other than to say that, okay, well, a cell, if it wants to, can convert glucose into fructose, or it can convert fructose into glucose, and that's the end of the discussion.
Right.
And our biochemical pathways, they don't work like that.
Right.
They are integrated.
Yeah.
And when you look, and they have different purposes, and how these are activated depends on what a person is eating at any given time. And humans have evolved this switch in order to rapidly put on fat and glycogen. They store water with the glycogen. There's an elevation in systemic inflammation, which stimulates the immune system, the innate immune system in particular, in order to, down the road, like under the right circumstances, we were meant to have that capability to increase our blood pressure, to have systemic inflammation, and to rapidly put on fat, because we were only eating that way in an intermittent fashion.
Right.
We
Now
weren't
eating it all the time.
Right. We weren't eating that way basically all day long.
Yeah.
So to come back to the chemistry a little bit, and this may make some of your viewers a little bit uncomfortable with this. I feel very strongly that we have a responsibility to ourselves to be as healthy as we can. And I have not worked with one individual over the last 5 years now. And I come at this from maybe arguably a slightly different angle than you do. You probably are seeing people that are, you can say, let me know where you are on this, but you probably have people walking in the door that want to do something about the sugar issue.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm working with people coming in the door that are ill with type 2 diabetes, as an example.
Yeah.
But of those individuals, I have not ever worked with one that isn't suffering from sugar addiction.
Yeah.
So really early on in this, I'm asking this question, just what the heck is going on with
Yeah.
this?
Yeah.
Why can't these people stop eating their go-to stuff? Why can they not let it go?
Yeah. Yeah.
Every time I have a person who I put on a good eating plan,
Yeah.
Everything's going good for about a week, and then all of a sudden the biomarkers are all out of whack again, and you're going, what is going on with this? Well, and down the road we go.
You bet.
With it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I've been there too. Did you have that at all when you shifted your diet? Did you?
I had to deal with cravings
Yeah,
for sure.
that's what I meant. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the chronic beer thing
Yeah.
is something that I still struggle with.
You bet. You bet. Yeah.
It's the same biochemistry, and this is why those of us who are practitioners need to understand that when we're trying to get these people to stop eating sugar, basically, but I'm using that as a really general term.
Yeah, I get it.
A lot of them will shift to drinking more alcohol.
Yeah, and absolutely, and
vice versa.
Yes. Yeah.
They stop with the alcohol, and the next thing you know, they're hitting the sugar really hard every single day.
Yeah.
And that's because we're talking about the same central biochemistry.
Yeah.
So let me lay out what this is.
Okay.
And all of this is confirmable. Later I can send you an extensive reference list if you need it.
Sounds
but
good.
basically, if we start with glycolysis connected to the mitochondria, and I'm going to call this state a burning state, where the incoming glucose is low. Now, I'm using adjectives that the medical establishment is using all the time, and even the researchers that are doing a really good job with this, like Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be just really clear. We don't know what this threshold is, and you're asking me about my own cravings or whatever. This threshold is going to, I believe, be different in different people depending again on what their overall genetics are.
Completely agree.
But that incoming glucose, as long as it's low, then glycolysis is going to function to produce some substrate level. We call it substrate level ATP. It's going to mainly function to deliver substrates, pyruvate and lactate, to the mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, your adipose tissue will be undergoing lipolysis, and there will be fatty acids being delivered to all the different organs in your cell, also to the liver, where those fatty acids are going to be entering the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is going to be doing this excellent job of burning to produce ATP.
Energy, which, just for the listeners, ATP, that's like our energy currency. Yeah,
it's like dollars.
Exactly.
We're spending it to do the things that we do, everything from walking to picking up our babies to generating, the milk that you're going to feed the baby, to if you're going to go running, you're going to expend energy. That mitochondria is producing that, the far bulk of that.
Yeah.
Now, as the glucose begins to rise, if somebody has a meal, as the glucose comes up, you're going to see a shift in the enzyme that's processing that glucose. You're going to go from this enzyme that's called hexokinase when glucose is low to one that is called glucokinase. And its job is to operate in an environment where the intracellular glucose is really starting to come up high.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, there's another enzyme that's called aldose reductase.
Yeah.
And it is activatable under the same glucose concentrations that glucokinase operates on.
Mm-hmm.
So as the glucose gets to a certain point, you're going to activate polyol pathway.
Mm-hmm.
And if these guys are eating, the standard American meal, and I'm just going to say this, I think it's really important for your listeners to understand this. And I think that as a practitioner, you probably already know this. The amount of glucose these guys the incoming glucose, the amount of added sugar and all the rest of the stuff that contributes to glucose is much higher than anyone is really letting on when we talk about standard American diet. So we're talking about a glucose concentration in the liver that is really going to skyrocket. And up to 30% of that glucose now, literally, it's a massive amount, is going to be pushed into endogenous fructose. The liver is making the fructose. This is also going on in the background in the brain, in the astrocyte, by the way. But I'm going to stick with the liver. And the endogenous fructose is going to collapse. It's going to be processed at 10 times the rate that glycolysis at that point is operating. 10 times the rate. And in the liver, there's going to be a massive accumulation of glyceraldehyde and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. This is when the switch happens. We have an acute decline in cellular ATP at the level of the liver. We have an acute rise in uric acid, which is a signaling molecule. It is not a storage molecule. It's a signaling molecule. Some would argue, who are in the know about uric acid and how it functions, it undergoes reactions. And once the uric acid is elevated, it causes a cascade of changes in how the liver is working. I'm going to argue that there's actually a change in state, that we move from a liver that was in a burning state to now a liver that is in the storage. So we have the activation of de novo lipogenesis, the active production of oil droplets in the liver, the production of triglycerides that are, and this is all confirmed in the literature, right? The fat that's being produced in the liver is packaged into VLDL. It's pushed into the circulatory system along with triglycerides. That's why when these guys go to the doctor and they have blood work, see such high triglycerides, is because that process is happening actively. You see at the level of adipose tissue under this state change that the lipolysis is shut down, both because there's an insulin effect and then something that is not well known, because in this change in state in the liver, you have what's called the Warburg effect. So that glyceraldehyde and dihydroxyacetone phosphate are pushed back into glycolysis lower down. And one thing that people don't understand is that lactate is actually the formal end product of all glycolysis. Even in the burning situation, if we go back to that state, the lactate to pyruvate ratio is literally about 10 to 1, 10 lactates for every pyruvate. And lactate is the predominant substrate of glycolysis. It's actually pulled into the mitochondria. Pyruvate goes in there too, but lactate is the preferred substrate that is then going to be burned by the mitochondria. So when we shift to this new state, because the glycolysis has risen to this point where polyol is activated, don't forget there's also added sugar in this meal, which means we have fructose coming in. And fructose is even a more potent activator of polyol. We use this term potentiates. So it also has an activating effect on aldose reductase. And if somebody's eating alcohol with the meal, and it doesn't matter what kind of alcohol it is, the ethanol also activates aldose reductase. It elevates the activity of it. So this mechanism that I'm arguing changes the state of the liver is what we call a feed-forward mechanism. The more of these substances that you have in combination causes that pathway to continue to elevate in how it operates. Basically. And so the liver is becoming fatty. You have systemic inflammation going on that has a number of consequences, one of which is that you're stimulating the innate immune system. You have I don't want to use the word dysfunction. You have an alteration in the function of nitric oxide, which
Oh,
causes the elevation in the blood pressure.
right.
All
That
right.
makes sense.
Now, let me know if I need to stop because I'm on
No,
a
I'll
roll.
interrupt you. So far, you just keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we step back from this just for a second and we ask the question, why do we have this in a human? You got to go back and think about evolution and hunter-gatherers, because we were not able to eat like somebody on a standard American meal, right?
Right.
We were eating this way intermittently, and we evolved the capability to rapidly put on all this fat to stimulate our immune system so we're ready to go out of the cave the next time.
Right. This is like survival mechanism.
This is survival.
Yeah.
We elevate the blood pressure because we need to push all of that stuff, the fat, the elevated glucose and all that stuff out of all the tissues that need it, right? In particular, the brain, right? So that we can think and function correctly the next time we're out. And we developed this system over millions of years with the brain.
Yeah.
In order to be able to find our way to the correct food substances, elevated glucose, high fructose, and some would say, well, what about the fat? Well, we know enough from the fat, and I'm talking now about the fat, not the fat that we're producing in the liver at that point. I'm talking about the fat that you're eating in the meal. And all of that fat that's coming in with the meal, the liver has been reprogrammed, is now entering, it's going to a lot of places. It can end up in muscle tissue. It's going to go into the adipose. But remember, we downregulated the lipolysis. So all of the fat going in there is just going to increase the fat load there.
Yeah.
And then the fat coming into the liver is being pooled. It's being pooled with all the fat that is actively being produced at that point.
Right.
And our brain is not only the wiring that starts with the mouth, right? The taste sensors that are there, but there is a cascade. There's a cascade of proteins that are produced. So let's first start when we have this change in state in the liver. I call it a shift to the red state.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. That when we activate fructose metabolism, this has been shown not only in lots of molecular studies in mice and in rats, but also clinically in humans. Clinically in humans. So we know that when polyol is activated, when we have exogenous fructose coming in with the meal, combined with alcohol and all of those things, that when this pathway is open for business, that it drives hunger.
Yeah.
So people eat more than they should.
So they're storing at the same time, but then also this switch is like, you want to consume more.
They want to consume more.
Yeah.
So the intake in food comes up, and there is a preference for sugar.
Yeah. Yeah.
With a heightened preference for fructose directly.
Yes. Okay.
So anything that has fructose in it, added sugars, you have the glucose effect, and then on top of that, you have the fructose effect.
Right.
There's a preference for fat, and we have both a change. We have a brain signaling that we've known about for a really, really long time. So the dopamine food reward system is activated. But really important here, I want to go to this now. We'll talk about PHOS-B again.
Okay.
PHOS-B is well known. The way it was discovered is because people have been looking in the brains of individuals who have OD'd on hard drugs, and researchers have tried to understand, okay, what's different in their brains after they're dead. If we grind up the brain and we look at on a molecular level what things have been expressed in there, what things haven't, and then other types of molecular studies that don't involve dead people. What's been found is that delta phosphB is critical in all forms of addiction. It doesn't matter what you're talking about in terms of hard drugs, it's overexpressed. And I've already said that in humans, it's induced by sucrose that contains glucose and fructose. It's Johnson has shown that it's activated by fructose. It's activated by sex and exercise
and stress. You said
and stress.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's a place that my daughter, who's also in this area, is really interested in trying to understand. You know, people who are repeatedly going back into social environments that are stressful are activating this protein.
Right.
This protein drives self-administration, it drives cravings and relapse, and it decreases the aversion. In other words, if you're sitting there and you're piling this food into your mouth, it decreases the tendency of your brain to signal that to stop, that you've had enough.
Yes. Okay. So it down regulates that whole idea that, I'm feeding myself, I'm getting full, but do you know, does it actually have an effect on like ghrelin or leptin? I mean, in that sense of fullness, or is it more just?
So the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
All right. And the reason that I don't talk about those guys up front and center mainly is because we know a fair amount about the insulin story.
Right.
And that's the other thing. Gosh, I didn't even bring that up. When you activate this pathway in the liver and you're in the red state, you have a profound change in insulin expression. Most all of us at this point would agree that the liver is the captain of insulin resistance downstream.
Right.
And the reason that happens is when you activate this pathway, you disrupt the signaling at the level of the insulin receptor in the liver, number one. So you're no longer getting the signaling that you should get in the liver. And then the second thing that happens, which is super important, is that the concentration of the insulin receptor at the level of the liver, at the plasma membrane in the liver, decreases in the red state. And so this means that just in terms of signaling downstream with the insulin resistance, you see an elevation that is signaled by the liver, but you also see hyperinsulinemia, because the liver is responsible for extracting between 50 to 80% of the insulin that arrives at the liver from the pancreas. And now, because you reduce the receptor there that's required for extraction, there's a higher level of insulin that is moving to the peripheral organs, downstream to muscle tissue, to adipose, to the brain, and so on. And everyone agrees that hyperinsulinemia is the number one factor that's driving insulin resistance. And with insulin resistance comes regulation of leptin and also ghrelin. But as you're asking a very systemic question right now. And the other thing you should understand is that fructose hyperactivates the pancreas to hyperglycemia, which also means that the amount of insulin the amount of insulin release at the level of the pancreas is going to also hyper respond because of that. And then there's an additional effect. We know that when fructose is elevated, and behind this is most likely the polyol pathway in the astrocytes, that elevated fructose metabolism causes dysregulation of the GLP-1 receptor.
I have this in my notes to ask you, but go ahead.
And I'm certain that you are probably concerned about this with your clients, because everyone knows that at this point that people that want to lose weight are taking Ozempic and Wegovy and all of this, and which are interacting with the GLP receptor. And fructose metabolism disrupts that relationship. And that is one of the reasons. It's one of a myriad of things that are happening with that now, but it's one of the reasons why when these people take these newfound drugs and they're losing weight, when they go off the drug because they can't afford the $1,300 a month,
they're gaining it right back.
They're going to gain it right back.
In record time is what I'm seeing.
So that I know that I'm being pretty technical here, but so that your viewers understand this, if we need to step back and ask the question, what's going on here? Hopefully they can see that sugar addiction is real.
Yeah.
And it's happening on a systemic level here. Every time I ask a new question. I'm asking questions all the time. Before I was with you this morning, I was looking at questions in this area again. And every time you run something down, you don't find contradictions. You find things that make this story even, more complicated in the direction of the addiction.
Right.
So we have the dopamine reward system that is activated. We have elevation of a protein, which is super stable in the brain. Once it's been activated, if you stop the stimulation, delta phosphate stays elevated for months.
That's what I was just going to ask. For how long? Yeah, so that's intense.
And so for me and you, this really has serious consequences for our clients.
Yeah.
Because bottom line is, if they stop eating sugar, if they manage to do that for a few months, the delta phosphate is going to come down.
Right.
As long as they're not shifting in that process to replace the lack of that stimulation. Like maybe they go in the direction of sex. Maybe they start working out like there's no tomorrow.
I know, I was thinking that too.
Yeah. And maybe they're hyper seeking these stressful environments, or they're doing all three of these things, right? So let's say they're really good and they just eliminate all of it. But then they have a weak moment. There's a birthday party, and they hit the cake really, really hard. And they have an IPA with it. Now they're in trouble.
So is it right back to it? Like it's right back on the switch?
It's right back on. And we're only talking about delta phosphate right now, but the activation of delta phosphate also activates a protein called CREB. And CREB is responsible for tolerance and the dependence issue. It mediates the negative emotional state, like that an alcoholic has, for example. So, you get up the next day, you haven't, and you have this sort of like you just feel like you're just completely down, and the drive to like reach again for that stimulus is pretty extreme. And the CREB also drives cravings and relapse. So both CREB and delta phosphate work together. And then, unbelievably, we also have an elevation in vasopressin, which is, so it's activated along with, so again, you have this cascade, the dopamine reward system, then you have delta phosphate, CREB, and vasopressin, which most people know of this hormone is being required during dehydration, but and it does have that effect, right? It retains water in your kidneys and also sodium. It retains water and sodium in the lungs. It's considered a survival hormone. So, if you're out there and there's no food and you're low on water, the expression of this protein or hormone in part is to increase the amount of time that you have to survive. You find the receptor for this protein, however, this hormone, in multi-organ systems, including the liver, where we have the red state. It increases during de novo lipogenesis. So the activation of fructose uric acid metabolism causes the elevation of this hormone. It increases aggressive social communication, and social foraging.
Yeah.
It causes territorial behavior. So
Right.
this is where the sugar addict is protecting. I call it protecting their plate.
Yeah.
Like I know I got to know during my 30-day live-in with a type 2 diabetic obese sugar addict, one of his friends every day would go through a complete massive carton of blueberries, a muffin, and a can of Coke. Well, actually, it was several cans of Coke. And by God, when I had discussions with this individual about, you could just try it. Don't have the carton of blueberries.
Right.
Maybe eat this instead. Maybe have some eggs and something like that. You could see the anger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Immediate anger. No,
right.
no. I'm not giving that up.
Yeah.
And vasopressin also supports or induces reward driven eating.
Sure.
Vasopressin, by the way, works in concert with oxytocin. And oxytocin actually has the opposite effect.
Yeah.
So
love hormone or whatever you want to say. I mean,
yeah, the love hormone.
Feel good. Yeah.
But it also influences normal eating. I shouldn't use the word normal, but an eating behavior that actually functions on you being legitimately hungry.
Right. Right.
It modulates energy balance and metabolism. It's weight reducing when it's being produced at the correct levels.
Yep.
Right. The balance is that there should be more oxytocin than there is vasopressin, and it suppresses reward driven eating. So the ironic thing is, when you look at the biochemistry of obese individuals, you find that they have abnormal levels of chronic vasopressin.
That I have not heard that. That is fascinating.
And by the way, elevated levels of lactate.
Right.
And remember that lactate is something that is overproduced.
Yeah.
It's a signaling molecule, number one. It's not just energy producing.
Right.
It is like uric acid in that it does influence the biochemistry in the cell. And we know, for example, that during the red state, one of its functions is to feed back on the mitochondria and downregulate the ability of fatty acids to enter the mitochondria in concert with malonyl-CoA. And malonyl is being produced because of the de novo lipogenesis.
All right.
Okay. So when uric acid rises, it causes the translocation of NADPH oxidase into the mitochondria, which downregulates an enzyme called aconitase. And aconitase, when it's downregulated, interrupts the Krebs cycle. So you have this massive accumulation of citrate, and citrate gets pushed into the cytoplasm, and citrate is the major substrate that induces de novo lipogenesis. And then as the de novo lipogenesis is taking place, you make malonyl-CoA, which feeds back on the mitochondria to cause the effect where fatty acids can no longer be transferred in there that would normally be oxidized
for
the
energy
burning state.
Yeah.
And lactate is even a more potent downregulator. And because of the rise in lactate during the red state in the liver, it's pushed into the circulatory system. And in addition to insulin, lactate feeds back on the adipose tissue at the level of the plasma membrane, and also downregulates lipolysis. Now, I'm sure, because I know how athletic you are. I think we're pretty similar that way. You work out hard every day. You're moving.
Well, we should talk. I've changed some of that, but go ahead. Yes.
So we know that lactate rises.
Right. Yeah.
In the burning state.
Yeah.
So this is really an interesting paradox, because we also know from Brooks's work and Ignacio San Millan, that everything I just told you about elevated lactate in the red state,
Mm-hmm.
if we shift back to the burning state where we have incoming glucose that is in the low range, we the burning state is clearly where you should be spending most of your time.
You bet. Yep.
But we know that if you go out and you exercise, that lactate's going to come up. You can measure it. I do it all the time because I'm trying to understand this stuff.
Yeah.
We know that lactate is a signaling molecule. Obviously, its regulatory capacity at the level of burning has to be different than its regulatory capacity in the red state, because we know that if you're in the burning state correctly, right, you're correctly there, that lipolysis is not downregulated, right? Your adipose tissue is pushing fatty acids out into the circulatory system where they can get around, circulate around to the various organs and tissues, and then be burned for energy, for sure in the liver. So this is an area of science that really needs to be.
It's definitely not completely explained. And I've been listening to a couple other people. I mean, this is definitely coming up, the lactate piece. Heard other people talking about it too.
Lactate is really, really important to our survival. And I don't want to get off on a tangent, but you have three evolutionarily really important molecules. You have acetate, and you think acetyl-CoA. You have lactate, you have uric acid, and those evolved into an energy system, I guarantee you, before we had cells that had integrity. This happened really early on in evolution. And you see those three molecules at the core of everything that's going on at the level of metabolism. Now, so hopefully I've given you an overview of the sugar addiction. So at the top of it, at the level of the brain, we have the dopamine system. There's a brain switch that generates delta phosphate Krebs. We have a hormonal switch that vasopressin is definitely involved in. There's in terms of what came first, the chicken or the egg, this starts with what people smell, see, and what they put in their mouth. That's signaling in the brain already. And also, though, to the organs that are going to be receiving these substances, pancreas, liver, right? And arguably, who's seeing that incoming information first? We have this metabolic switch, and I'm contending that's the fructose uric acid metabolism that I believe is being governed to a much bigger degree than people realize by polyol. And that's communicating directly with the brain. We know that from the initial work that came out of Johnson's lab. So maybe people that are listening to this, and this has serious consequences too, because the pathway that we're talking about is a central mechanism that drives the diabetes, the obesity, cardiovascular disease. I mean, it's shocking how much of this metabolism is happening in the endothelial layer of our cardiovascular system. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and gout sufferers. And most of our community, the low carb space, everyone pushes gout away. We hardly get any attention at all. But let me just say, and your viewers should understand this, because I'll bet some of them are probably suffer from gout, that for us to understand gout on a molecular level allows us to understand more so what's going on systemically, because there's a substantial amount of crossover in the biochemistry. But let me go to, what is the value of everything that you and I just talked about?
Let's do some practical things here.
What is the practical aspect of this? Because really that's what I'm about, is how do we use what we understand now to actually do something about our conditions? And to go on record, I think that sugar addiction in a general way of talking about it is involved in all these chronic metabolic diseases, every single one of them, because I haven't seen in 5 years, all the people I've worked with, every single electronic forum that I talk in, do I see the pushback when it comes? And it's the willingness to let go of that stuff. And I believe that we all operate on a continuum.
Right.
I think for me, I'm on the low end of the continuum. I had to deal with the cravings and whatnot in the beginning, but there are other people like my friend and my client in Salt Lake City who may well end up dying. What can you do? Well, first off, you can eliminate the substances that we know activate this pathway.
Right.
That's added sugar for sure. Right. And
yeah, because let's explain to the listeners, because when we talk about fructose, when we talk, I mean, there are so many, you know, when we say sugar, there are so many that I think sometimes people just think table sugar.
Yeah, absolutely. So anything out of a box, bottle, or package going to have sugar in it.
Yeah.
I'll just tell this story really, really fast.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was shopping the other day because I do all the cooking, or the evening meal cooking for these guys here, my daughter and her husband. And behind me, there were two ladies pushing food baskets, and they stopped. I was facing away from them, and they were talking about the fact that they were now eating healthy diets, and that they had eliminated sugar from their diet. How, and all of these, you know, things that are supposedly positive or whatever. So my ears perked up, and I turned around without them noticing. I was careful, and I looked at their baskets, which were full, and their baskets were completely full of processed food.
Yeah.
You know, it was frozen meal, this, lean cuisine, that. I mean, later when I got home, I looked up some of the lean cuisine, you know, and these meals, some of them have got 40, 50 grams of added sugar in there. I felt like trying to chase them down, and
I know,
and later and go, okay, you guys have got, your hearts are in the right place.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a piece of it. You know, like I said, I think so many people, when you're not maybe in this space yourself, it's that educational piece. We aren't taught these things. It is almost like, unless you have a health scare, and even when you saw the medical doctor, most of the time, if you go see a medical doctor, you're not going to get this sort of information on nutrition, you know, where sugar hides. You're right. It's everywhere. Yeah.
So, not to make sure, because I know we're going to have to end pretty soon. So added sugar, that means no processed food. Staying away from processed meat as well. That really correlates with, for those of us who suffer from hyperuricemia, processed meat is really, then the main ingredient there is going to be glutamate, inosine monophosphate, and adenosine monophosphate, that has all been made more accessible when you grind meat up and you mix it with other stuff. Alcohol component is really a big deal, and that includes all alcohol. Like in the low carb space, you get these guys, and I used to be one of them 5 years ago, because I didn't know any better. In fact, I even gave a talk once in a clubhouse. One of the coaches came in near the end of it very angry, and they were like, "No, Dr. Pete, on the ketogenic diet, we can drink hard liquor mixed with club soda, and, you know, dry red." He was just reading to me off the list of things that they give out, low carb forums, and I waited for him to finish, and I was like, "No, see, what you don't understand is that it's the ethanol itself that activates this pathway."
Right. It's not just the carbs in the beer.
You know, it doesn't help that some types of alcohol also have really high carb loads. Yeah, of course, that's a problem. I'm not saying that it isn't, but the ethanol itself is actually, you know, and I didn't get into it, but there's actually 4 major metabolic ways that alcohol is activating this pathway. The hyperglycemia, massive. You know, I get into this all the time. With clients too. It's like, well, I'm eating healthy carbs. It's like, look down at your plate for me. Take a look at it. What proportion of that healthy carb is on that plate compared to the low carb, good, you know, the vegetables I think that are good, and the amount of meat you got on there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's like, well, okay, there's a ton of potatoes here. I'm like,
right.
you know, in the beginning, when you're making this shift, I'd recommend going to 50 grams of total carbs, no more than that per day. Get keto adapted, and then you can start talking about
Adding back.
moving back in the direction of a whole real food, no processed food type eating environment. And even myself, I'm working carefully in that direction. But that's not until you're keto adapted. But even more importantly, you know, you've reversed the metabolic issue you have. So,
and would you say that do you think that takes labs? I mean, I know you do a lot of personal testing, or do you sometimes have clients where you're like, okay, you know, based on how you feel, like, how would someone know they're kind of reversing that, or they kind of know maybe the switch has been turned off?
There, how you feel is definitely a good component.
Right.
The biomarkers.
Yeah.
Are they normal?
Right.
And have you reached the normal weight?
Yeah.
And this is the thing. These people that are paying $1,300 a month for, you know, Ozempic or Wegovy, when you look at how those drugs work, I mean, they're getting about a 12% weight reduction in the use of those drugs. I forget how many months it takes, but they're missing a point. And the point is, if you do what you and I are talking about, and you take time, like I lost 33 pounds over the course of the year.
Wow.
That I think it took me to really get keto adapted. And now I have the same weight that I had in my 30s.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I weigh like on average about 136.
Right.
And my height is 133 to about 136, and my height is 5'6".
Right.
So, you know, and then the thing is, I've elevated my calories. All right. In the beginning, when these people start a program like this, and I know that you understand this, because they are so overweight in general, even including the ones that look thin.
Right.
As soon as they start generating ketones, their appetites are suppressed.
Yeah, definitely.
And they're going to eat less.
Yeah.
So they are going to calorie restrict. And of course, the establishment and a lot of these trainers and whatnot will push back, and they'll be like, well, see, you're calorie restricting and we're arguing calorie restricting, but it's different.
Yeah.
We're not talking about pushing through hunger.
Right.
And what I've noticed is, as over the course of the last 5 years, my weight, my biomarkers, all this stuff is normalized. And I have had to elevate my calories because the fat that I had is gone.
Yeah. Well, and plus, you know, I was going to say too, you're so active, because, you know, when I'm talking with clients, I'm always hitting this stuff. You know, my approach is very individualized. I think yours is too. But do you have thoughts on, you know, each individual having a specific maybe carb tolerance? Like if you are super active, or your age, or.
Yes. And you know what? This shift into the red state, look closely at what activates it, because what I have found with my clients is they usually fall into categories. Some of them, you know, got to have that the blatant added sugar.
Right.
You know, maybe it's the chocolate every night before they go to bed. Or I've had some clients that are like, okay, I had, well, like this, well, she wasn't a client, but I did have a type 2 diabetic client who secretly was having a big, huge bowl of strawberries with honey on it every single morning. And it took me quite a bit of time before I discovered he was doing this.
Right.
My Salt Lake City client, his go-to was hyperglycemia bread. You see this a lot.
Yeah.
Bread, pizza was his favorite thing.
Yeah.
With, and pay attention to this,
Mm-hmm.
dark red meaty processed meat
Oh,
sauce.
yeah.
That's
Sure.
the umami. That's the
Yep.
glutamate.
Yep. Yep.
He almost had no preference for sugary stuff like
Yeah.
a candy bar or
Yeah. Like
that kind of stuff.
right. Right.
And so I believe that your clients are going to break out into categories.
Mm-hmm.
And there are even, Heather, I've learned, and I've tried to help these people. They're actually colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
I know some of the coaches working in this area are carnivore.
Right.
They can't even go anywhere near these other things at open polyol, but
Yeah.
they are still experiencing volume problems.
Yep. Yeah.
And the reason that is going on is because they have elevated, with carnivore, they have elevated protein.
Mm-hmm.
And glutamate is a potent activator of this pathway.
Right.
So what I've counseled to them is to make sure that they're eating a wide variety of protein in their lifestyle, rather than, like, a lot of times with carnivores, you'll see these guys, they'll be like, they just eat ribeye steaks all day long.
Yep. Right. Right.
And, I'm not making that up. I don't know how many clients I've had who are still flaring with gout.
Yeah.
That are doing that. They're eating high quantities of ribeye steaks all day long.
Right.
And the first thing I have them do is like, all right, look, the meat world is a lot bigger than this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Diversify what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because our human body tends to like optimize stuff that we're eating. That gets really good at a certain type of food that you're eating every day to really maximize how, what it's doing with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, and I have found that with those guys that quite often their situation improves.
Yeah. When they just start diversifying the protein that they're eating.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is, and I highly recommend this, hypoxia is something we didn't even talk about.
Yeah.
This activates fructose uric acid metabolism. And where this comes into play is if these people have sleep irregularities.
Mm-hmm.
And it's especially prevalent, 50 to 80%. I don't like that range, 50 to 80%, but that's because these are observational studies,
right,
of people that are obese and or type 2 diabetic, suffer from sleep apnea.
Yeah.
And gout sufferers fall into that same range. And the reason this is happening is because all of our organs, it doesn't matter what they are, have hypoxic zones, right? Where the capillaries come to a certain point, oxygen is delivered at that point, and then the oxygen has to diffuse through the entire organ. And so all of our systems, like even the kidney is famous for this, right? It separates different metabolic functions based on the hypoxia zones. The liver is similar. And so if somebody is suffering from sleep apnea, several times, literally during an hour, their breathing rate literally comes to a stop.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that causes the hypoxic zones in these organs to skyrocket.
Right.
And here's what happens. When hypoxia increases, fructose uric acid metabolism is activated. You get the Warburg effect, and you get everything that we talked about, the elevation in lactate, all of these de novo lipogenesis. That's why when these people are eating the way that they're eating, if they've got sleep apnea on top of it, this is why they can, one reason why they're gaining so much weight overnight.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Fascinating.
So they should be sleep tested. Every person I have a discovery call with now, when I have it, I'm like, okay, here's what you should eliminate out of your diet first. I went through the list with you, and then I'm like, and get sleep tested.
Right. Yeah. It's huge. Huge. What about, I'm kind of switching us here just for a second, but what about sugar substitutes? Do we know if that switches the same pathway on?
Well, we know that some of them, I think erythritol, I think has an insulin effect. I think there's some data for that.
There is, yes.
And what one, and here's what I would, and then there's also preliminary data that they really jack with the microbiome.
Yeah.
I didn't bring up the microbiome because I have a commitment to the science.
Sure.
And I think the microbiome work right now is too much in its infancy.
Yeah, yes, I would agree. We don't know anything really.
Right. And then the last thing I would say to that is, and this is really a big deal in our space trying to help people, is that, and this is one thing that I think most medical doctors don't get, and certainly our culture doesn't understand, that when you have a negative result, that is absolutely meaningless.
Right.
You probably didn't ask the right question.
Right.
So just because a sugar substitute does not raise glucose doesn't mean it's safe.
Right.
And the fact is, some of these are so sweet. I think that the jury is really out on how those substances might be cross-activating or working to influence the metabolism that we know is connected to the brain in really a big way. So I'm super cautious about that.
Yeah.
The thing I would say about it is that the sugar addicts, the last thing that they should do is replace. Benton Janssen has a word for this, and coming up to my discussion with you, I was trying to remember what the hell it is. I call it replacement. That's how I talk about this. So, one of the things that I'll say this for the viewers, I know that you already know what this is, but sugar addicts automatically, when you talk about eliminating these substances from their diet and going to a whole real food environment, first thing those guys do is sit down and try to generate the workarounds. They're right back to eating the way they were before. It's the idea that an alcoholic can walk into a bar and have one shot. They might get away with that on day one. Right. It's like, okay, now we're at 2 shots.
Right. And then what about, I know I'm going to get questions on fruit, right? Talk about fructose. Obviously, there's fructose in fruit. Thoughts on eating fruit?
So when you ask the medical doctors that are in our space, if you ask Johnson this, if you ask Robert Lustig this question, they're going to be, oh, come on, man. There's enough fiber in there.
That's what I've heard him say all this. Yes. Yeah.
And having one piece is no big deal. But then on the other end of it, the problem that I have with it is that I've not met anyone who I have helped as a client, nor have I heard the reasonable discussions in electronic forums that treat fruit realistically. In other words, they're not just having one piece.
Right.
They're eating a lot of it. And the addiction, the rationale is going to be, well, I need the nutrient, I need the minerals, I need this, I need that. And the addict voice is so powerful with that rationale. Basically, they're eating too much of it.
Yeah.
And they're probably eating it at times. So let me just say something. I want you to think about this when you go away, because hidden underneath this is a strategy all of us need to think about. Because what this boils down to, whether or not you open polyol, or whether or not you open fructose uric acid with exogenous fructose, is completely dependent on how much of that crap, the glucose, and I'm going to call it crap, is showing up at the liver within a defined amount of time. Because this is all around, whether you open that pathway or not, depends on thresholds that you're exceeding.
Right.
And we don't know what that threshold is. This is an area we should all be screaming and yelling at the researchers about trying to understand. I mean, in my opinion, what our field needs are scientists that are going to actually sit down and try to see what that threshold is in really well-defined standardized cellular studies, just like what we did to understand how DNA is transcribed into RNA. People don't realize that those original studies were done in a test tube,
right?
And they were done with bacterial viruses, not even in animal cells yet. And then once we understood how you could make an RNA off of a gene in a bacteria, we then moved to standardized systems within animal cells, HeLa cells, and inside yeast, and then those were extended to worms. I mean, we need that kind of research in metabolic science. We absolutely need it, because there is a threshold there, and that threshold is going to fluctuate with different people differently, because even though we have the same genetics, we have different genetics. Like,
right, of course,
both you and I, seasoned coaches, we know that when someone comes in the door, we're dealing with an individual. We're not dealing with an average.
Yep.
And coming back to the fruit, we don't know where the threshold is.
Right.
And come on, when we go into a store and you look at the fruit,
it is a little more like candy these days, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And when you and I are out climbing, right, and we're walking through the Black Hills in late July and August, and we're eating strawberries off the vine, these are little teeny berries.
Right. And they're more sour than sweet. I mean, they're still delicious, but it's very different. Yeah.
It's very different than this big, bigger than quarters, I don't know, $50 size strawberries. And then these guys are going to eat a bowl of them, and they're either going to dribble honey on them, or they're going to put sugar on them.
Or whipped cream.
Yeah, exactly. So the problem I have is, I think these guys need to really ask themselves the question, why am I asking about the fruit?
Right. Yeah.
What really is the motivation?
Yep.
Yeah.
And
I eat fruit.
Yeah.
I put blueberries on my salad.
That's my fruit of choice too. Yes.
But honestly, when I look at a sugar addict putting blueberries on their salad, and I have some in the extended family, I put 4 or 5 berries on mine.
Right.
And they're desperate for help.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, are there comorbidities? They need to know that. Am I suffering from? And obesity is a comorbidity.
Absolutely.
Are there comorbidities? All right, how do we fix this? I believe going low carb in the beginning is really, really smart. It's a whole food, low carb environment, though. No processed food at all. And that includes the keto marketing.
Yeah.
Right? And then as they get healthier, they lose the weight, they can progress. And this is what I do in my own work. It's what I'm doing with me, to a whole real food environment that does have carbohydrates in it. But again, they really need to look at the plate.
Right.
What's the proportion of this? When I make yams for my wife, I'll take one circular yam that I've cut that's maybe a 1/4 inch thick.
Yeah.
I cut it in half, and I put 1/2 on my plate.
Yep. And what would just for the viewers, that would be what? Like, what are we talking there? Like, if you're doing, did you say half a yam? So that's how many?
No, not half a yam, half of a circular piece.
Gotcha.
Of it is maybe.
Yeah. So hardly any carbs in that, basically. But yeah, if you're doing a half of a yam, I'm just trying to give the viewers like a visual on how many carbs that would be. So
it's just a few grams.
Yeah.
I think these days I've graduated from 50 grams of total carbs per day to probably maybe 100.
Yeah. And you you work out a lot. I think of all those things that I'm sure, and you've done a lot of healing over the years too. So you're not in that state.
And I'm still healing. I've been drinking too much beer since I've been here.
Yeah.
I'll just be honest to the viewers.
Yeah.
And when I go home, I'm going to have to deal with that again.
Right. Right.
So it's like,
it's a journey for sure.
It's a journey. We all are on the journey, but eating a whole real food environment at the appropriate time, not over, this is the thing, not overdoing the carbohydrates.
Right.
And a lot of people don't want to do this.
Yeah. Well,
but
hard.
You can monitor your biomarkers.
Yeah.
And I get a lot of my knowledge from, the reason that I only eat a half a yam is because I know what it does to my blood glucose post meal at a half an hour, hour, and 2 hours. And I know we're close to being done, but I want to come back to the threshold.
Yeah.
Because when you actually go aggro on the science and you look up the published data on aldose reductase, because this is the key enzyme, going back into the 80s and 90s and getting the original papers and looking at them, of which our people don't do. And you look at these papers, though, and they showed decades ago that aldose reductase is activatable. And when you look at the concentration of glucose required to do that, if you go to the American Diabetes Association, they're going to tell this person that before you see them or I see them, that having a glucose of about 140 at 1 hour post meal, 140 per deciliter, is normal. They're going to use the word normal. And I got news for you. When you look at the original data on aldose reductase, that activates polyol pathway. And so through my own process, I always try to eat so that my post-meal glucose is well within that value. I try for 110 basically maximum. Great. At 1 hour.
Do you find, what about like food combining? Like, do you find if you are going to eat a specific amount of carbs, like, do you try any of that, like food combining, to try to keep that glucose level lower after the meal?
I think that kind of idea works. And I think if you and I are having a personal discussion about it, and we're like, because I do that. But here's the problem. If a sugar addict is asking you that, the addict voice trying to do another workaround, and I have direct experience with that, because in more than once, but in Utah, where I was with that guy, we had a pretty intense argument about this. And I'm like, no, you're not doing that.
Well, to your point, exactly. And what we've been talking about, it is very individualized. It is really knowing where you are at, and then and I'm always very into, like, we own that. We're very honest about that. I mean, that's how we make change, by being very honest, by owning our thing and making decisions based then on hopefully being educated, enough to make good decisions around food. And like, are you someone who can now use some food combining to keep your, glucose level lower after? To your point, it really does depend on where.
It really does depend. And unfortunately, in the beginning, I think as coaches, I know that for me, it usually takes a few weeks for me to find what's underneath this, but understanding this metabolism allows us to actually write down categories. And by interacting with the client a lot, we can see which categories their stuff is falling into. And, and they got to understand, and this is my view, that getting healthy takes a lot. We have a pill mentality, and going whole real food or low carb for a week or two is not going to be enough. It takes a lot of time to get back healthy. And then, like you said, coming to terms with how close the association is of sugar with how we eat is really important. Because if the addictive voice is so powerful too, it's going to try to argue back to eating that way anyway. It can do it. So, and then I guess one thing we didn't talk about is the support networks. The more serious the sugar addiction is, the more help they're going to need to do it. And I don't know. I guess when I was in Utah, I was with my client 24 hours a day, not sleeping, obviously, during the day at work. And I went to his food addiction and recovery meetings. The thing that really struck me when I went to those meetings was that the room was full of just human wreckage. Wrecked. Everyone was obese and overweight except for a few of them. And all of them had tremendously tear-jerking
Yeah.
stories involved in their family.
Yeah.
Just,
Do
you know,
Well, I know I see a lot of clients who maybe fit that similar, or similar. There's often a lot of trauma, and that's more my area, but there's often a lot that's gone on for people in this space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my daughter Tanner, who
Yep.
she's focusing on the trauma.
Yeah.
It's all tied together.
It is. So now I'm going to switch us back just for a second, because I really, really, really wanted to ask you about your thoughts on, I guess, a plant-based diet, which these days is getting pushed and pushed and pushed. So wondering your thoughts.
Well, okay. So on the plant-based thing, I don't want to be, honestly, I've sort of quieted down in my own presentations and even in coaching the last 6 months or so, because I feel like our space has gotten more and more apologetic about things, and I am adamant. We spent all this time talking about what I think is the central driver of all this stuff. I mean, I think there are going to be other drivers of insulin resistance and whatnot. I'm not naive about it, but this is the only literature-based, well-confirmed biochemical mechanism that I can find that's out there that has strong connections to the brain. And we know, so what this teaches us is what has to be eliminated. And the idea being that we only want the red state to be activated intermittently. That's really what we want. I don't like to use the word dysfunctional. And that's something everyone does. It's like, okay, we're eating the standard American diet and we're causing this dysfunctional metabolism. I'm like, no, we're not. We're causing evolutionarily directed metabolism, and it's doing exactly what it should be doing. It's just when you have it activated 24 hours a day, week in, week out, year after year, that we end up with the organ damage and then the dysfunction. When you ask about plant-based stuff, I'm like, look, if you have a thing about meat, fine. If you want to turn your health around, you have to pay attention to sugar. I'm using that in a general way. Alcohol, the hyperglycemia, the umami, and the sleep apnea. It doesn't matter how you want to deal with it, but those things have to be eliminated. So the problem with the plant-based diet, even though I think there are lots of arguments being made out there by credible people that down the road you can have nutrient deficiencies, all that aside, let's say you can deal with that, fine, take supplements, whatever it is. The problem with it is that a lot of the plant stuff that they want to put on their plate is generate hyperglycemia. And, I don't know that there's not necessarily a problem with the umami part of it, that if they're eating vegetarian packaged food, then umami's most likely been added to it. Yeast extract kind of business, celery powder, all umami that's being added. And maybe they're still drinking alcohol, and the ethanol part of it is an activator. I think it maybe has a bigger, I'm going to speculate, think that maybe the alcohol component of fructose uric acid metabolism is a bigger issue, maybe, for those of us that are considered thin on the outside, fat on the inside. That phenotype,
Yeah, it does make sense. So do you focus more on like protein forward? Are you full keto, which would mean probably more of your diet's fat? Or
I recommend in the beginning, if someone is definitely got comorbidities, and that's the problem. The clients that I've had, I haven't met one yet that doesn't have, the comorbidities in general to also wanting to lose weight. So I take them ketogenic. I ask for grams of total carbs per day. More than that, none of this counting. I don't have them counting calories or any of that business.
Right.
I teach the plate method. You can break parts, put your green listed vegetables in two of the quadrants and then your meat in the other. And once they have gotten to be metabolically, healthy, keto adapted, metabolically healthy, then they can start manipulating this and moving back towards whole real food with some carbs in there. Again, it's an individual thing. And I've worked with a lot of carnivores too. I communicate or collaborate quite a bit with Tanzim Murphy. She's a low carb dietitian who works with Nutrition Network. And when she has postmenopausal women come to her, having a variety of different issues from IBS to, even thyroid, she automatically takes them carnivore. And she stabilizes them 2 to 3 months, something like that, where the symptoms have gone away. It doesn't work for everyone, but it works for most of these women. And then she says to them, all right, now if you want, start working back. Add your vegetables in, the ones that you want to choose. Start with the low carb ones, and add just a little bit at a time. And we want to try and see which of them might be causing work pretty good. So, I mean, if someone comes to me and they're like, I'd like to have your help, but then they say they want me to coach plant-based, turn them down because I ethically believe that you can't do this with a plant-based diet.
My experience with clients has been, it's tough because, I really want them to get that, their full protein amount in a day. Those, and essential amino acids, because, the population dealing with is typically, their 30s up into, their 70s. And so just for the muscle maintenance, like all those sort of things. And if they're vegan or vegetarian, it's really tough to get that amount of protein in a day because it takes so many extra calories, You're
saying right now, if you listen to the influencers that really study the plant-based diets, they echo exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I've definitely tried a few times and have not had any luck. Okay, another question I wanted to ask you was your thoughts on if you think we could mitigate that pathway somewhat by using some circadian rhythm strategies, things like blue light or red light timing, things like meal timing, things like sleep. What are your thoughts?
The short answer is yes. We can't ignore the sleep, which has been going really rough for me since I've been up here visiting, mainly because I've been drinking beer at dinner again. Anything that you're messing up with circadian rhythm, I mean, in my own lifestyle now, I try to time restricted eating is a good idea. I think what I try to do with my wife and I in Phoenix is to at the latest finish dinner by 6 p.m. And if I can get away doing it earlier, I do. My wife kind of pushes back on that, but if I can finish dinner by 5, I do that. Here, when I'm visiting, it's really hard because these guys are oriented around eating really, really late.
Yeah, right.
And so every night I go to bed, I know that it's not a great situation. And I know that when I don't get good sleep, I know that my fasting glucose, even in these days, can be disrupted. And this is the thing. I think that, again, I think our space is guilty of not looking at the whole picture. And the insulin resistance issue and fasting glucose is not just contributed or controlled by the liver. It's also almost 50% of it is being controlled by the kidney. And the kidney, so there's only 2 organs that do gluconeogenesis, and it's the liver and the kidney. And I think that when you have sleep disruption, that the kidney is the thing that is causing the dysregulation in the morning glucose. That's my opinion. It's speculation right now. I haven't been able to track the really, really good literature on that yet. But in part, that's because our space has accepted insulin resistance as being the driver of all this.
Right.
And I'm going, yeah, I agree with you. It is. But
Mhm.
we need to know what's underneath that. We can't just like, we, this is the way I feel pretty strongly about it, Heather. We cannot
Mhm.
do what the medical establishment has done to us, which is shut up. We
Yeah.
know, do
Yeah.
this, and you will
Yeah.
be better, you know? And
Right.
it's like, okay, I agree. Insulin resistance, Jason Fung, all of that. We're hearing we're hearing these talks over and over and over again.
Mhm.
And I'm sitting here going, okay, fine.
Mhm.
Here's the next question. What is driving the insulin resistance? We
Right.
cannot not ask that question. And when you raise the issue about sleep,
Mhm.
that is pointing fingers directly at the kidney.
Right.
We need to know the relationship between the pancreas, the liver, the kidney, muscle tissue, adipose, and the brain, because there is one. The guys that study insulin extraction at the level of the liver, when you read that literature, there's a lot that we don't know. But
Mhm.
I'm very happy that they're pounding away at this, because
Right.
one of the things that they have shown unequivocally, for example, is that the pancreas and the liver are deciding together on a molecular level how much insulin is going to be pulled out of the portal vein
Mhm.
and degraded by the liver.
Mhm.
So it's deciding, the liver and the pancreas together are deciding how much insulin is going to go downstream to all the peripheral organs, including the brain. And we know that when this pathway is activated, that the extraction phenomenon is uh, is being disrupted. That's just one example, and maybe I'm getting off on a tangent, but I
That's
think that everything that you brought up with the blue light issue,
right.
um,
Mhm.
people not taking care of their sleep, staying up too late,
Mhm.
the level of exercise, you know,
Mhm.
all of this is contributing, because we know that the muscle tissue is responsible for about 80% of the glucose utilization,
Right.
right? The brain gets 20%. These numbers are off a little bit, because Lord knows all of our tissues are requiring
Of
glucose
course.
and fat
Yeah.
and you know and so on. But I think another area that I get really frustrated with it, and this happens, I even saw a talk in San Diego um, that suggested that, in fact, just going walking is good enough. And I'm really getting tired of hearing that argument. It is not enough, right? Especially myself trying to climb the stuff that I'm trying to climb, not
Mhm.
successfully yet. I'm getting my ass kicked one way from Sunday on everything. I haven't had, I'm not even climbing the 510 routes in Victoria Canyon consistently yet.
Yeah, but Pete, you started this trend with all your grading around here when you started putting in all the original roots on the limestone. So, I'm just saying it comes full circle.
Yeah, it does. And I don't mind that. But what I've
Yeah.
learned being 65 is that, you know, all of this stuff matters.
Yeah.
The weightlifting, the high intensity work,
Mhm.
having something that one likes to do movement wise,
Yeah.
besides just walking is not enough. Humans had to work really hard to get their food, you
Right.
know. That's another thing when you listen to a lot of people out there, that plant-based guys in particular, they're
Mhm.
acting like back when we were hunter-gatherers, that we could gather all this carbohydrate up and eat
Right.
things. And it's like, no, dude,
No. Yeah.
have you ever, I mean, when I was a kid in the Wind Rivers, I taught survivals for 7 summers. And I know, even though I wasn't a caveman, I know how hard it is to hunt and gather food. It's really
Yeah.
hard work.
Yeah.
And you utilize all of those energy systems, sprinting, the walking long distances, you know, the stuff that it takes to do that stuff. And humans, especially as we age out, we cannot, in my view, we should all be doing that. We cannot, like this walking thing. I see it in my extended family too, is like, I even had one of those guys over in a discussion along these, they're always asking me about this stuff. And I pointed this out, and this guy says to me, well, I'm not one of those persons. I've never worked out in a gym, and I'm not ever going to. And I was like, you don't have to go to a gym.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 You can do lots of things at home, body weight, all the things.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can sprint down your road.
Exactly.
Yeah. What do you think about, because as you're talking about this, so I'm thinking about things like I've had clients where I get a fair amount of clients who are what I would describe as over exercisers. And, you know, they get their hard drivers, they get their labs done. They're, you know, I mean, cortisol is high all day, you know, all the things. And, you know, so we do sometimes have them lessen their amount of exercise. I mean, do you see anything like that? Do you have thoughts on that?
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I'm one of those over exercisers.
That might be why the climbing isn't going so good if you're training too hard.
Yeah, I think I did overtrain. I admitted this openly last night in a conversation. I mean, I think I did, and I think I've been working too hard. And I tell everyone at home, in this space, or other people that are my age that are still doing. I mean, the reason I stopped going to a CrossFit box formally was because I knew that I was overdoing it.
Yes, that was me too. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
As a trainer, I still utilize, I really like the hits that come from them. And I went and got specifically trained in strength training by Ripeto's people.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
But, you know, now what I'm trying to do is find a holistic way that actually is working.
Yeah.
And I think with the climbing that I went in over my head. I went too hard with it in coupling with the other stuff that I do. And it's like, I know that when I go home, my goal now is to sit back and figure out, all right, dude, you're actually maybe hurting yourself.
Right. Well, and I brought that point up because I just want our listeners to know too, again, and we're kind of going back to the theme of a lot of this, but you know, it's very individual. Everything's very individualized, you know? So you have some people who are doing nothing or just walking, and they really do need, I mean, it would benefit them to include some strength training, whatever that may be. And some, well, sprinting, but you know, I'll just call that power work or whatever. Right. And then you have some other categories of people who are so overdone, you know, that they need some time to, maybe they are just walking for a time period. But with that said, eventually, well, those clients I've dealt with, eventually you get back to, the idea is to get back to a space of health where you can then engage in that type of movement again.
Exactly. I agree totally with that. And I think about this from the point of view of being in later years now, you know, and it's like, I want to be around a long time. My wife told me a few years ago, she's like, I want to live to 100. And I looked at, this was actually over 5 years ago. And I looked at her and I thought, well, crap, I got a long ways to go then.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
So, you know, that's what I look at. And then, you know, with the people that I've helped, some of them are so sick and they're really, really young.
Yeah.
By comparison. And I don't think some of them are going to make it if they can't get off the sugar. And then do what we're talking about. Look at all these other components that should be in the lifestyle. And that's what I'm trying to do. I want to live. I'd like to be able to be around when my grandson is in his 20s, right? And that's a big ask because I'm going to be pretty damn close to 90.
Yeah.
And most men, I don't think, especially my age group, if you look at the news lately, these guys are kicking off my age group left and right. At really young ages. And it's like, I really don't want to be one of those guys. So I figuring this out. And then when you have extended family, I don't know what yours is like, but mine has full on, there's metabolic diseases everywhere in it.
Right.
And every time I'm around them, like even recently, uh, one of the wives was asking me about my rock climbing,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, I've been working really hard and actually feel like my capabilities are going down. And I think it's because I have overtrained.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then her husband chips right in and he
Mm-hmm.
goes, well, you are 65.
Right.
And you just aren't going to be able to do this stuff.
Yeah.
You should face up to that now.
Hmm.
And I'm like, sorry, man.
No, thank you. No, thank you. Well, I just always feel it's one of those things where it's like you want to keep moving, you want to keep doing the thing, but the overtraining piece for probably, I think we have some similar personalities. And so, that type of personality can overtrain because as we're getting older too, we have this tendency then to overtrain even more so, I think, to try to, I don't know, get back what we had or something like that, or climb how we used to climb, whatever the thing is. But, it's that important. I think recovery becomes probably could become more of a focus to really help a person get into the space they actually want to be in, which actually means backing off and all those things. But it does not mean, succumbing to what this person said to you.
No, I
just
know. And that's the thing.
Just deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of these guys, I mean, we have close family friends too. And we were at a dinner over there and there's metabolic disease in that family, not related to us.
Mm-hmm.
And her view is like, she openly said, I'm not planning to be around much after 72.
Wow.
And I'm going, I think I worry about a comment like that. I told her this. I said, when you're on your deathbed, I'm wondering if we have this conversation again, if you're going to agree with your decision.
Yeah. Time goes quickly,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
okay. One last thing. Because this was, as we were talking, I just jotted this note down and then we didn't cover it. But do you think that, so I'm thinking with kids, right? And I'm thinking about, your new grandbaby and, all these things like with that pathway, with that switch, do you think it matters like how we are feeding our kids right from the start? So I had this thing when Mira was born and, I did not want to give her sugar because I did not know, all this biochemistry behind it, but I knew enough and I was enough in this space and enough of a nerd about it. Like I really had some thoughts on not wanting, I thought of it more with her taste buds, to be honest. Like I didn't want to train. That's how I thought about it. Her taste buds was sugar. And so I really wanted to keep her away from sugar in particular. We were somewhat successful at that for at least the first, year at least. But probably beyond that, we really, really limited it. And I'll be honest, she actually, she'll eat her carbs, but she doesn't have that sugary, she's not a sugar person. She eats a lot of like whatever, greens, broccoli. Like she has these very bitter tastes that she will just eat as a snack. Do you think that can train sort of the brain, the palate, the switch? Like, how do you think that works?
Oh, well, we didn't really get into it, but this protein delta phos B, it causes remodeling of the dopamine reward system.
Okay.
So you cement in the need for these sugary substances.
Right.
And I've been applauding T because she had a low carb baby.
Yeah.
She's probably like Mira in that she really limits the amount of sugar that she eats, and she's not like me. She's not cutting carbs out of her lifestyle, but she sticks to whole real food and minimizes it.
Yeah,
and
that's how I eat. Yeah.
Her boy is super healthy, man.
Yeah.
So I advocate for this lifestyle for our children. I don't think. And then there's another aspect of this. There is type 2 diabetes in our family line.
Oh, yeah.
So, there's no question about the fact that if a mother with a child in utero is eating that way, that they super predisposition the baby to those conditions.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So good to know there too. If we can have any control over that, the earlier we can have control over it.
Yeah, I worry about the formula. I mean, she's breastfeeding, but you know, just go through the store and turn the bottles of formula around. It's shocking.
Yep. Nope. I know. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay. Well, anything else you feel like you'd like to touch on or talk about that we may have missed?
Yeah. The last thing I would bring up, because I know the extent of athleticism you are, and I get a lot of questions about metabolic flexibility.
Oh,
and one thing that this model of metabolic, the shift from white state to red state, is if we know that there's a great deal of difference in gene expression of people that remain in the red state. Like Noakes is recently, there's a paper that came out in 2023 by the lead author was Prins. And they looked at of course, these are still endurance athletes, and there is the negative result of not knowing more about like strength training and whatnot. All that aside, though, when you look at these elite athletes who are allowed to be on a standard American diet for an appropriate length of time for a month minimum, and you measure their VO2 max, and you look at the protein expression, glycolytic enzymes versus enzymes involved in fat burning and other molecular aspects of it, there's a difference between those individuals that spend most of their time in the red state and the same elite athletes where they've had a washout and then they've spent 4 weeks in a low carb ketogenic lifestyle where they're, and the other thing to say about this is they're eating a prescribed diet, right? This isn't willy-nilly. You're not doing this with surveys and things like that.
Got it. Okay.
That when you look at, I'm calling them white state athletes, there's significant differences in their ability to fat burn during different levels of exercise. So for the red state athletes, their VO2 max is at 65%. For in the low carb environment, the VO2 max is 85%.
Fascinating.
And fat burning is even detectable at 100% VO2 max, where it's completely absent in the red state athletes. So I think that is really, really interesting. And it suggests, again, based on my model, and I think, honestly, there could be a lot of arguments with me because I'm the only one who's talking about this, really. But I think metabolically, from the point of view of incoming substances, we have the white state, and I think we have a red state. It's possible that there could be other state permutations of that, because not everybody eats exactly the same way, but there's definitely proportionality. So somebody in the red state is a more glycolytic individual. They depend more on the cycle of glycolysis and exercise than low carb individuals do. And this is genetic, but also I believe exercise defines a completely different state. And in somebody who's burning, spends most of their time in the burning mode, when they shift to the exercise state, right? And I mentioned this earlier in our discussions, there's elevated lactate.
Right.
There's no argument there, but the lactate is also has hormonal qualities to it.
Yeah.
And the signaling of the lactate at that point has to be nuanced, because you also have, in the burning state, you also have fat burning going on. I mean, you also have fat burning going on in a red state athlete, but that athletic state has to be different than a white state athletic
state,
state, because the proportionality in the gene regulation and everything is distinct. And this has something to do with keto adaptation. I think, somebody who's in a red state for 80-90% of their day, let's just say as an argument, their proportionality in enzymes is going to look a lot different than somebody who's in the white state.
Right.
That they did, where these people were on diets for 4 weeks at a time, is not enough. But it's difficult to do. It's difficult to do this where you have athletes that are eating only one way for 20 months or,
of course,
24 months, and then, but this is another argument for really strong molecular studies being done in tissue culture, for example. Those kinds of studies could be done in looking at proportionality of enzymes in membranes and things like that. There's just so much molecular work that needs to be done to really get at these questions. And we're dealing, I believe, in a space where most everyone, even the so-called experts of the experts that we hear from all the time, are standing out in a field. They're looking into a forest. And we can't really know what's going on unless we walk into the forest and we find where the well's coming up, and then take that apart and then start working back out. Yeah.
Well, I think it's going to take your voice and a lot, maybe just your voice, Pete, to where, we start to get into that space and get some of that work done that needs to be done. Do you eat a specific way when you are climbing or expending a lot of energy? I don't know if you're still CrossFitting at home or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not trying to distract from where you were just going, but I'm thinking in terms of when you talk about the red state athlete versus the white state athlete, the white state and having that higher VO2 max. So, well, I guess my question would be, what do you eat when you are performing athletically? And then how does that differ than maybe you eat on a rest day or a recovery day?
I actually haven't gotten so far that I've actually messed with a rest day.
Got it. So you're kind of the same every day.
Yeah. What I've done is I've definitely elevated protein. So my breakfast might be, which I try to eat later in the morning, but my breakfast might be 4 to 6 eggs and then some kind of protein with that. It could be a small steak. It could be, God forbid, it could be in a bacon, because that is a processed meat.
Sure. Right.
It could be some kind of minimally processed sausage. I always try to have protein with that.
Yeah.
And then I have been experimenting during the day when I'm out at the Craig, using magnesium beta hydroxybutyrate.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
In my drink.
Yeah.
And I think I've been having issues we've already talked about in this with overtraining.
Right.
So I don't ascribe right now my diet to being the reason. The reason I say that is because I was climbing better before, feeling like when I was running stable ketones that my endurance on routes was much better.
Yeah.
So I've been trying that, and then when I get home at night or in the late afternoon, having a meal that it's more elevated in protein. Like I was telling Luke, that arguably I've moved towards carnivore.
Yeah.
But I don't know how honest that is, because I've also been adding in some more carbohydrates. Like I told you about the yam. I'm also partial to acorn squash, squashes that are like that. So I really, right now, I feel like just being completely open, that I'm actively experimenting with that.
Love that.
I don't I don't really know. I mean, the one thing that I do manage really well is I'm not introducing any sort of sugar
Right.
or fructose. I think my biggest vice is the alcohol thing. And when I get home, I'm going to get that back under control where I'm
Yeah.
not drinking every day.
Well, it's a typical response to travel and being out of routine, you know, that I think most of us deal with, where we kind of go back to some habits from before, you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So
So
you were able to get rid of the chocolate then too?
yeah, no, I'm not. I don't touch
Yeah.
any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And my
Okay.
wife is always going, I don't know, how can you do this? Because everyone around the table will be on their third helping of pie and ice cream. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't need it. I don't want
Yeah.
it. And I'm
Is,
not going to eat it.
yeah. And is it because like, you know, how crappy, I mean, for me, and I have my vices too, cookies. People who listen to this show know it's cookies. So, but I know if I overeat them at this point, how shitty I'm going to feel the next day.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's kind of what you go to, because sometimes that's the only thing that can hold me back from consuming many, many, many cookies.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just try to hold to the whole real food thing. I know because I do run ketones every single morning.
Oh, you do test every day.
Well,
Okay.
not every single day, but I'm spot
Mm-hmm.
testing now, and I always come in at 0.5 millimolar in the
Okay.
morning. But
Yeah.
when when I elevated my protein, and this was a while ago, I
Mm-hmm.
was testing every single day, and even
Mm-hmm.
before and after meals. And so I know my ketones prior to pushing the protein up
Mm-hmm.
were always running between 1 and 2 in the morning. And
Okay. Yeah.
now they run between
Yeah.
0.5 and 1. And
Right.
so I attribute that to the elevation of the protein, mainly because, there's an insulin response to it.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense for sure. Yeah. But you don't necessarily feel worse or anything like that.
No, I feel
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Good.
Um, up until when I went home at the end of my summertime climbing here,
Mm-hmm.
I felt, well, actually, when I arrived,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I was feeling like I just wasn't recovering. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that came on rather than how I was eating, that followed some ridiculous weeks that I spent mostly in the gym
Mm-hmm.
doing, 4x4s on power, and then, 5x5s
Uh-huh.
endurance, you
Yeah.
know,
You're
and
doing it all.
I was,
Yeah.
and then, even doing that silly stuff with 3-finger drags, pulling weights off the
Oh,
floor
yeah. Yeah.
and weighted pull-ups. And then I come up here and I just was like, I just felt like I couldn't really, I was surprised.
Yeah. Yeah. You thought you were coming in strong and it wasn't that way.
No, yeah, I felt like I couldn't, I didn't, I just felt like I didn't have the energy to do the routes I want. I'm talking about like 5-10 A's, and
Right.
so I did the best I could while I was here, and then I went home, but I feel like I'm still there, and I need to start over.
Yeah. So do you feel like, will you change then the amount, like, will you change stuff with your macronutrients? Will you change your protein amount then? Like or do you not have thoughts on this yet?
No, you know what? At my age and whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
I realize one thing this has taught me over the last 5 years
Mm-hmm.
is not having an open mind is
Mm-hmm.
is a certain way to failure.
Absolutely. Yep.
I'm
Yeah. Curious.
having issues climbing what I want to climb, but is
Yeah.
that because I'm 65 and can't do it anymore, or is it because I overtrained myself? I'm kind of thinking that's what it was.
Yeah. I would
Um,
guess too.
does it mean I'm not going to be willing to manipulate my diet? No, absolutely not. I'm going
Yeah.
to try after I get home to get objective about this. Like I
Yeah.
told you, I'm thinking about getting a coach.
Yeah.
And everything's on the table. In
I
fact,
love.
I want to go have my bloods done again to see where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, what would be kind of cool is if I don't know if you'll go this route. So my journey with that a little bit was I actually had, well, yeah, I had my carbs I wasn't recovering and just awful. And I also have some thyroid stuff that I've been dealing with for a few years. And so that played into it as well, no doubt. And also female, whatever, we're different. But I did up my carbs a little bit. Anyway, my point was, if you would decide to do something like that, it'd be cool to have your blood work before and after.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people in the athletic space who eat like we do have done some elevation in carbs. And I'm totally not against that.
Yeah.
Like when in fact, I mean, I think I've acknowledged I've kind of done that.
You have.
I'm sort of like playing around with that a little bit. The other night after getting home from climbing with Mike, and we did 5 routes, and I was really beat up. I'd made the stupid move of going to the climbing gym the day before that. And when I got home that night, I had an extra large helping of acorn squash.
Yeah.
So absolutely, you're right. I am not above that. Because I think we know a lot, like the stuff that you and I have talked about this morning, I think is really important to understand, but we also don't know anything.
Right.
And that's my training as a scientist. I think when I look back, I'm really thankful I went to graduate school where I did, and that I had the mentors that I had, because they were like Johnson. They're like, okay, so this is what we think we know. How much of it is wrong? And then you turn around and you go after that. You don't go, okay, we know. And now that this is the last thing we need to talk about. I know what I need to do. I know that I need to stop sugar, alcohol, hyperglycemia, umami, and hypoxia. And now everything's going to be better.
Right.
Well, I guarantee you there are issues in that statement. And we don't know the nuances yet. There's just not been enough work.
Yeah. And that's what I love about you. You are a true scientist, like truly open, truly curious. Never saying, well, this is exactly the way. I mean, that's how it should be. That's how we learn, and that's how we figure things out.
Yeah. And we really need that in our space. We really need it. And there are trends in our space that one of the reasons why I quieted down the last 6 months with my own presentations is that I'm somewhat alarmed at it. I don't like it. I don't think it's healthy for our space to be making absolute statements about things.
Oh, completely.
That are not absolute. And that are bound to change. And one of the things is this preoccupation claiming that insulin resistance is at the brunt of all of it.
Right. Yeah. I agree. And it definitely makes, people, we do this because we love this stuff and we nerd out on it, and it's fun and we have a passion for it. But, this isn't everybody's thing. And so anyone else this is not their thing, they're doing their thing. And then they're trying to get information. That it's so confusing for the person out there, so confusing to the point, you probably get this too. I get a lot of clients who are like, I've just given up because I hear so many different things. It's almost like decision fatigue on what to do. So I agree with your point.
I think that you and I are in a business that when someone finally comes through the door, they're at the end of their rope.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Anything else you want to add?
No, my voice is going away.
I know. We've been talking forever. Well, I just really, really, really appreciate you coming on and talking and sharing all your knowledge. That was super interesting to me. I'm sure it will be to many of my listeners as well. Do you want to just let us know, like, where can they find you? Where can they follow you? Where can they find you?
Okay. We have two websites, www.drpeteandt.com. And then if you suffer from gout, www.drpetesgoutintensive.com.
Okay. And can you I'll get that stuff from you, and then I can put it in the show, like below the show too, so people can just go there to find them.
Yeah, I think I sent it to you in an email.
Oh, did you? Okay.
And that I thought I sent it. If I didn't, just let me know and I'll resend it.
Yep, perfect. That sounds good. And then I know you're on LinkedIn. Anywhere else people can see?
Facebook, LinkedIn.
Oh, YouTube too. You're on YouTube.
YouTube. Our YouTube channel is Dr. Pete's Keto Club.
Perfect. Okay, sounds
and
good.
Also on Twitter.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. I don't really do anything there. It's just that when I make a video and put it out on StreamYard, it automatically loads there too.
Sure. Love it. Yeah. I haven't made it to Twitter yet, but yeah. But I'm on Instagram, so that's probably just as bad. Whatever.
Yeah.
So it goes. All right. Well, thanks again for being here, and would love to do it again sometime. So let's try to make something else happen down the road.
Oh yeah, let's do it again. And then also I'm going to be basically having the same discussion I had with you on the Quit Sugar Summit.
Okay. Oh, great. Can people watch that, or where do we?
I believe it's free. All you have to do is register for it. And if they go on Facebook or LinkedIn and then search Quit Sugar Summit, it'll come up. And there's something like 60 or 80 people are going to be talking.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I will definitely check that out, and sure my listeners will too. Appreciate that very much.
Thanks so much to Dr. Pete and all that information. That was really fun for me and really interesting things to be thinking on. And if you want to get in touch with him or follow him around, you can go to all his stuff, which I have listed below in the episode description. And then for next week, stay tuned, as I'm going to kind of condense a lot of what we talked about into some very, very practical strategies. So based on everything we learned today, that will be next week's episode. So stay tuned for that. Did you know you can find a lot more help from me on my website? Go to heatherheynen.com. Heynen is spelled Heynen, and get in touch with questions on all things I offer, like online courses for overeating, weight loss, goal attainment, and also my coaching and counseling services. Just a reminder that this podcast represents my own opinions. The content here should not be taken as medical advice. The content here is for educational and informational purposes only. Please consult your doctor or healthcare professional for any individual medical questions you may have.